Según ahí ya estamos en vivo.
Listo.
Listo. Ya pueden empezar a presentar.
Bueno, acabamos. Sí, ya estamos en vivo.
Ah, sí, ya estoy viendo el streaming en vivo. Sí.
Según ahí ya estamos en vivo.
Súper.
Sí, estamos en vivo. Ok, buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Muchas gracias por estar en este nuevo Meetup de NoCo. Esta vez estamos haciendo el Meetup de julio, debido a que la semana pasada tuvimos un inconveniente y no lo pudimos realizar. Pero estamos muy contentos de poder tener acá a un invitado muy especial. Y también estamos muy contentos porque estamos celebrando 3 años de la existencia de NoCo. Hoy va a ser algo muy especial porque aparte de tener esta charla con Ben, vamos a rifar unos cursos de Udemy. En total tenemos 10 cupos. Los invitamos para que se registren en el link que tenemos en el chat. Ben va a dar la charla en inglés, pero si de pronto tienen alguna inquietud, se la podemos hacer llegar a él, ya sea en inglés o en español, como se sientan más cómodos. Y no se preocupen en cuanto al tema que va a dar Ben, porque la mayoría de la charla va a estar enfocada en un demo. Él va a hablar unos 15 minutos, una parte técnica, pero el resto del tiempo vamos a enfocarnos en el demo. Pueden hacer preguntas si quieren al final o también durante la charla y se la haremos llegar a Ben. Okay, so let's get started, Ben. We are really happy to have you here in our NoCo meetup. We are celebrating 3 years today. And this is going to be our first English meetup. We hope that this is not the last one. And we hope to
So
have you. Yeah, and we hope to have you. I don't know, you want anytime that you want to join us. It's a really great experience to having you here, and we are really happy. So we are really happy to have you, Ben. Welcome to NoCo, and we are really excited about your topic today. So
thanks.
Yeah, the microphone is yours.
All right. Well, before I start my screen share, I'm very grateful to be here. I hope that this is not the last English meetup that you run, because otherwise it just means that I've done a really bad job, I think. So hopefully it goes well. And I do also have both the comments up here on the screen. So if questions come through, I'll try and address them. My Spanish is just good enough to know that Ruben just told you that I'm doing a demo. And that's probably about as much as I understood. So if your questions come through in Spanish, I'm sure one of the organizers is going to translate that for me. And I've already mentioned to them that I'm happy to take questions as we go through. If you send the questions through in English and I notice them, then obviously I'll answer those as well. So thanks all for having me. I'll just start my screen share. So I want to talk today about Jamstacks and basically how to bootstrap a brand new blog with commenting system from scratch. So what I'm going to do is start off by going through what Jamstack is for those of you who aren't familiar with it. But that's really only going to take about 5 minutes, maybe 7 minutes of the presentation, depending on how long it is before I actually start. And then after that, we'll get straight into the demo and we'll start pretty much from scratch with no code and get something working by the end of this session. So a bit about me. I've been a software engineer for over 20 years now. I actually started off as a PHP developer back in 1999. That's like 2 decades. That's a 19 at the beginning of the year. That's so long ago. I feel really old all of a sudden. But I love software development. It's something I've wanted to do since I was a kid, and I'm really grateful to be in an industry that allows me to do that from anywhere in the world, and to have the technology now to speak to everybody around the world as well. For a long time, I've been really crazy about privacy and security. I used to be a security consultant as well before I started working at Auth0. And then I met somebody at Auth0 and they said I should apply for a job. So I did, and here I am. So I now work as a developer advocate for Auth0, who I'm sure you've probably heard about them because Ruben works for them as well. But we're basically an identity in the cloud solution. I'll be touching on Auth0 a bit. We'll create an account or a tenant and use it within our project. But essentially, all you need to know is that in the same way as you wouldn't write your own credit card processing system, Auth0 is what stops you from having to write your own identity and authentication mechanism. Does single sign-on and all of those complicated things for you. So that's a bit of background about me. Let's have a look at what JAMStack is. So often you might have heard of things like the mean stack or the lamp stack or the something stack. And usually what they mean, they define the technologies in the stack. JAMStack is a little bit different. It actually defines more of a philosophy of the stack. It's not about which technologies you use. It's about using JavaScript of some sort. And we'll have a look at some of the different applications or frameworks that are often used in JAMStack in a second. The A from the JAMStack is APIs. That's how we bring data into this JavaScript front-end static, essentially, website. Or a single page app as well, which gets loaded once, but then runs in your application. And then you've got the markup, which is the content that gets shown in your website. So by splitting these three out, it gives you a lot more control over various aspects of your application development. And also it makes it a lot easier to design your architecture of how you're going to host it. So JAMStack's a very popular thing at the moment. You've probably heard of it. That's what the JAM stands for, those three aspects there. So like I mentioned, the JavaScript is the application logic. The markup often is actually a markdown format. And then APIs allow you to do extra stuff with your application. So we have a look at just the top level of what a single page app might look like. So this is, probably can't see it, it doesn't matter. This is a little bit of a header of what a React app looks like. And it's basically just a mostly empty body on a JavaScript that gets pulled in that then renders things in real time from your browser. It'll pull in things like markdown files that contain the content that it's going to render, and then you'll get a web page. But that by itself is now just a static application that you can't do very much with. So on top of that, we can also add in frameworks and APIs that allow you to do something like take a React app that we've got and talk directly to third-party APIs to pull information in real time. So the traditional structure or the traditional format of having a server generating all the contents and sending it to your browser isn't what JAMStack does. It'll just send you the basic framework, and then your framework from within your browser while you're running it will pick information from various places and display them properly in your web application, which puts a lot more of the load onto your client's browsers, which is not a bad thing. It actually makes the application faster for them in many cases, not necessarily all the time, but that's one of the advantages, is you're decentralizing the generation of the websites into the browser. The data there comes from multiple external systems, and the feel of the application is a lot smoother. So one thing I've been looking at over the past 6 months or so is moving on to more static site generators as well. And there are various static site generators that will allow you to generate a single page app. So Gatsby is what we're going to be looking at today. Gatsby is actually based on React. And when you build a Gatsby app locally, during your development process, or when it's deployed to a server and it gets built before it first gets served, it actually generates essentially a React application. Hugo and Jekyll are other kind of static site generators. I've used Jekyll before. If any of you have used GitHub Pages for hosting anything, you might know that you can use Jekyll as a static site generator pretty easily within the GitHub infrastructure to deploy your markdown changes, for example, and GitHub will automatically rebuild your website for you. The thing I used to use Jekyll, the reason I moved away from that is that the deployed application from Jekyll doesn't contain a framework. It's essentially just static HTML. So to do something like a React app running in Jekyll would be a lot of hard work. So I just moved to Gatsby because it's built in. It's designed to do that from the outset. Then once you've got your application, your configuration for your static site generator, it can then also pull information from, or it uses JavaScript to build the site, and it can then also pull information from the markup files and also from APIs at build time. So the APIs can now have two purposes. You can use it as, you could have, for example, a headless CMS that pulls in your blog content and builds it statically and then serves it, because that blog content isn't going to change between builds. Whereas something like comments, which is what we'll be looking at today, will be more dynamic and we'll pull that from an API. So what's happening here is you can see, again, you don't need to actually be able to read this, but this here is a Gatsby app and that's been built statically, which is going to serve this React application. So the biggest problem, I think, that we face when we now look at all these applications running in the browser is they've got to access APIs. And those APIs, for the most part, if you're pulling information, that's fine. It's mostly public information anyway. Comments are public. So it doesn't matter if that API isn't secured. But if you want to post something or make a change on the API, you need some kind of security. But you can't have secret keys in your Gatsby or your React applications that are running in the browser, because browsers are essentially insecure environments. We can't trust browsers. We don't know what plugins are running. We don't know if there's any cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. We don't know what's happening in that. It's out of our control. A server, we have more control over. Somebody else's browser, we have no control over. So we can't put passwords into our application for talking to APIs. So this is where Auth0 or other identity as a service providers come in. And what we're going to be looking at today is using Auth0 to generate basically the login mechanism that provides us with an access token. And that access token is tied to the user that's currently using the website. And by sending that access token up to the API can then verify that the person who's making the request, so the actual user, because remember, this is coming from the browser, not from the server. So when somebody's logged into your website and they make a request, it's on their behalf. And the API can make sure, is this person logged in and do we trust them? And are they allowed to do this operation? So in a nutshell, that's what we're going to be looking at today. There is no questions so far. As I've said, ask me questions at any point and we'll go through. So this is where we're starting from today. I actually did this directory listing before I did a couple of steps just to get the process started, but essentially we've got an empty directory here. We've got the README file, which, and this code is all on my GitHub repository. I'll share a link with the organizers sent through to you, or if I can find it, I'll post it into the comments or something. So you can use this. And the README file basically contains my notes for today to take us through the process of building this. So you can do it yourself in your own time as well. So the only things that I've done in advance of time, which are in the README file as well, is I've run this command here. So this is basically, I've got the Gatsby command line application installed already through NPM. I'm going to create a new project. It's going to go into a directory called blog. And I'm going to use this Gatsby starter blog as a starter position. And this is going to download and prepare for us a Gatsby application that's got a blog built in. So it's gone through and done all of the NPM install already. So if I'm actually going to start code up in this directory here so that we can see the API eventually as well.
Ben, sorry to interrupt you. Are you sharing
Yes.
your screen? You're showing your console or something, because we are not seeing it.
You know what? I probably shared the window instead of the screen. Let me just stop the share. That's always annoying because in the previews you see.
And I don't know if you were showing something while you were talking before. Yeah, we are now seeing the scope. Yeah.
Okay. Were you seeing my terminal all the way through as well?
Yes.
Yes.
That's annoying. Let me just very quickly. Can you see that? My presentation now?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Let me just do a really quick recap of what I just went through. I talk very quickly. Hopefully you kept up with what I said before, and I'll go through this. So this is my picture. I've told you about me. JAMStack, I basically told you what it stood for. And then we had a look at how things are built. So we've got our React code here. We've got the markdown file that's get pulled in here, which generates a static web page. And then we've got various frameworks that we can use within that. So in this case, we're going to be looking at a React app today, which can pull information from an API or push information to an API. And then I started talking about the static site generators that we use. Gatsby is the one that we're looking at today. And when you use something like a static site generator, it'll take a whole lot of JavaScript for the business logic of how to build the website. This is not what's running in the browser at the end of the day. It's just the generation code. It'll pull information from Markdown, and it can also pull information at build time from APIs to generate the content that goes into your static page. That then all gets rendered into a different HTML page. This one here is now the Gatsby application, which is also running React under the hood in our case, but it could be a Hugo or a Jekyll generated site. And then you get, instead of having the markdown here, this, if I was able to zoom in, is actually just some JSON. So what a lot of the frameworks do is they'll use JSON to pull in information that's been pre-built. But then you need dynamic aspects as well. So we've got the JavaScript frameworks here on the right. And those will need to make a request to an API, which when it's GET and it can be public is fine. But when we need to secure them, we need some kind of mechanism for authenticating those to the API. So this is where I then started talking about Auth0, which is where you can send your user to the Auth0 website, to your tenant, your instance of Auth0, get them to log in and get a token back. And that token can then be used for the request to the API, which can use the token to verify that the request is authenticated and valid. That was it. All right, good quick recap. Check the questions again.
We don't have questions. I will let you know if we have any questions. I was sharing the project, the Hoyser.
Oh, yeah, cool. Thanks. So you can see my desktop now, my terminal.
Yes, you can see.
Okay, so this is the empty screen here, which, like I've mentioned, I'll share the repository with everybody later. So I've run. This is what I was talking through before that you wouldn't have seen either. This is the command that I ran, Gatsby new blog. This is the directory that's created when I create the new project. And this is the project starter that I'm using. You can just run Gatsby new blog and it'll create a blank Gatsby application. But there's a whole lot of different starters that you can pull down as well. And I'm using the starter blog, which we'll have a look at now. So we jump over here to the blog. I'm just going to go into the blog here. If we run Gatsby develop, that's going to start our develop. I can't type and talk at the same time. That's going to start our development environment. And while that's getting started up, let's have a look at what's happening over here. So you don't necessarily need to understand Gatsby or know Gatsby or React hugely for today's talk. If you've got a moderate understanding of JavaScript, you'll be fine. But essentially what's happening is we've got this Gatsby node file down here, which is using GraphQL to pull out all of the data from the content directory, which is in Markdown format, and to generate for every blog post, we find it here. So this GraphQL is basically pulling down all the remark files. And in content here, we've got blog files. And then for each blog entry that we want to render, we've got a markdown file, and we've got any images that we want to show on that as well. This is all straight out of the box. So we've got Gatsby running down here now. If I open this up, for some reason, Firefox has stopped working on me today. So I'm going to jump back over to this one here. So it's running on port 8000. So we now have our Gatsby starter blog running over here, and we've got the 3 blog posts. And if we go in, we can see this one here is Hello World, had the image. So Hello World has this image, which was stored in this directory over here. And all of this is generated statically. So this is now being loaded. Essentially, you don't need any clever kind of a web server. It can just be any web server that just serves static HTML files and the assets like the images and the JavaScript and whatever else. So we've got our blog. That's working. If we wanted to add new blog posts, we can basically create a new directory over here, create a markdown file, rerun Gatsby develop, or if you're in production, rerun Gatsby build or npm run build, and then it'll generate the new application, the new blog posts for you. What we want to do today, though, is to add a comment system in here that will allow us to make sure that only registered users are able to comment. So the first thing I'm going to do is check my notes to see what I'm doing next. Yeah. So we'll jump over in here, and under source, this is where all of the files are stored that Gatsby uses to build the static website. And like I mentioned here, we've got this Gatsby node file, which basically looks for all the markdown files and builds a blog post per file. And those blog posts are based on this blog post template. So we're going to come into the blog post template over here, and we want to add some comments to the bottom of the page. So let's scroll all the way down to the bottom here. To where are we going to go? So we've got the next previous links here. Here's the article, there we go. So in just above the navigation, we're going to add a new component. We're going to pull in a new component called comments, and we're going to pass into it the slug. So what we want to do is we want to render comments for this web page, and the slug in this case is this part here, the Hello World. Now, by default, within this implementation, this Gatsby implementation, that slug isn't available yet. So I'm just going to have to pull that in up here. The page context that comes through, this is contextual information about the page that this template needs to render. We need to pull out the slug as well. So I'm just going to add that in there. Now, of course, we're going to get an error down here now because the comments component doesn't exist. So let's come into the comments directory here. We'll create a new file called comments.js. And I'm just going to copy and paste some text here, and we'll walk through it rather than me typing it out in its entirety. But we'll see how this works. So every component basically needs to import this React. If you're familiar with React, this will make sense to you. It basically allows us to use a whole of the React functionality within this component, which is going to get rendered in the blog post. We're using functional components here rather than class-based components. So we're going to define this functional component called comments. And we already know that we're passing in the post slug. That's what's being passed in on this line here, post slug. So this is being passed into our comments component here. We know that we're going to have a message that we want people to be able to submit, a comment to make. So we're going to store this. We're going to use useState to remember that message and then use that for submitting to an API, which we haven't built yet, but we'll get there. I'll skip over this bit for now, and we'll just go down to have a look and see what's returned. So we're just going to return a form to start with, which has a text area. The value of that text area is whatever message it is that people want to submit. If that gets changed, so the way that React works is that you actually need to bind these elements to a local variable, essentially, so that when you're posting that information, you're using the variable rather than attaching something to the form itself. It's just a built-in mechanism within React that makes it a lot easier for React to do clever things with your interface, because remember, this is a lot of magic, maybe, happening within the browser that Gatsby or any single-page application provides to you. So one of the things that always happens with form elements is you always bind a value to a local variable, and you have an on-change handler. So when we hit the submit button here, it's going to call this submit function, and you'll notice that we don't actually address this text area element in submit. What we're doing in the submit function here is we're basically going to pull out the message at this point, which is the message that's defined at the top here. So I won't go too much into what useState is. If you've got questions about that, ask, and maybe we can go through that later if we have time. But essentially, this is a way of passing the message in. And when somebody hits submit, first thing we're going to do is prevent default. This stops us going to a different web page. We just want to handle everything internally. And then we're going to make a request to our API, which is going to run on port 3000. By default, when you start an Express API locally, it'll run on port 3000. So we're not going to change that. We're going to create an endpoint, though, called comments / whatever the slug is, because we need the API to know which page we're submitting a comment for. And it's going to be a post. We're going to provide JSON, and the JSON is going to be the message. And at some point, we're going to need to provide an author, because we want to know who posted this. But at the moment, we don't have that information. So let's just make the author question mark for now. So if I hit save on this now, we should get, OK, so comments isn't defined. That's because if we come back in here, I'm using comments, but I haven't imported it yet. So let's just come up to the top here, and we're going to import comments from components, comments. And if I hit save now, it should build successfully. Wonderful. So that's 5 lines of code in this page here, plus 34 lines of code so far that we've written. I'll be keeping a rough eye on how much code we're writing, because I like to show how little we need to do to build this. And because we've got an autoloader, we can see that this this prompt here has come up already.
Ben, we have a question in the chat.
Yes.
In Jamstack, API is saying that at CMS.
API you can use a CMS for your API. You can an API could be any API though. So in this case, we're not using. We're going to build our own API in Express that is going to, and we'll get to that in a second as well. We're going to build this, which is going to connect to an external database, which is where we're going to be storing our comments. So essentially, I mean, content management system itself, CMS, is a very strange term in that everything is content and we manage it in a system. So you could argue that anything is a CMS from that perspective. But in terms of the strict view of what is a CMS, like are you using Sanity or Contentful or a WordPress, headless WordPress instance, maybe in that sense, it doesn't have to be a CMS like that every time in Jamstack. It can be any. It could be any API. It could be a Stripe API for making payments, for example. So no, CMS. The API could be a CMS, but it doesn't have to be a CMS. So let's open up the. Hope that answers the question. Let's open up the console over here, and we'll see that when we hit the submit button, we're getting this error over here. Replace all is not a function, post slug. This is not the error I was expecting. This is always the fun part of live demos. So that was on comments line 8. Line 8, post slug, replace all. I wonder why that's not working. If anybody has any ideas, feel free to jump in. Replace all should be a function, right? Let's do replace any slashes globally. Let's try that one. Submit. Failed to fetch. This is not what I was expecting to happen. I think the failed to fetch is probably just the response to there being a 404. Let's just check. Because there's nothing running at the moment. Okay, let's ignore that one for now. I think it's because we don't have our API yet. But essentially what we're doing now is we're taking any slashes in the slug and we're removing them. The reason we're doing that is because we don't want the start and end slashes that might be visible here going through to the API. Otherwise, we're going to have maybe double slashes or slashes at the end. We want to control exactly what's going through. So any slashes in the slug get removed, and then we pass that through here. So the other thing that I ran before we started was these commands here so within the Jamstack directory, I made an API directory. We went in there, we initialized npm, and I ran install express. That's essentially all I've done in this so far. I just wanted to save a little bit of time. So we jump over to our API over here. I'm going to open a second terminal down at the bottom, which in fact, if I do this instead, we should be able to run them both side by side. So we'll go into our API directory. And if we just run npm start, we should have errors. Wonderful. Missing script start. What's happening? npm. We don't actually have any files yet. So what we're going to do first is we're going to create our index.js file. So this one's going to be pretty simple to start with. We just want to make sure that the API starts and that we can hit something at the other end. So we're going to require express. We're going to initialize our app. Here's the endpoint that we're going to be hitting, comment/ whatever the slug is. And for now, what we're going to do is we're just going to log the body that we're getting from our React application, and it should appear in the console down here. And then because you have to return something, otherwise the web request will hang, we're just going to return an empty object. We could even in here return the request body that way, and then we can get that in the browser as well. And then we're going to listen on port 3000. So if I save that now, and we'll run node index. And then if we jump back over to our browser, we should be able to go to port 3000 get, so that it's running. That's good. And then if we go to comment/, so this is obviously a get. So let's jump back in here and hit this submit button again and see what comes up in the network tab. So we're now getting a positive response here. We're getting a 200 OK, but we're getting an error. And if we jump over to the console log here, we'll see that the error here is probably a cause error. Let's clear. Why is my clear button gone? I'm so used to using Firefox that I can't remember where everything is in.
You can call the clear function.
I suppose I could, yes. Console.clear. Run it. There we go. So if we call this now, what we're getting is this cause error. So what's happening is we're making a request from port 8000 to port 3000. This is the same as making a request from example.com to some other site.com. For security reasons, we need the API to define which origins, which domains it's going to accept requests from. Now, in our case, we want to accept requests from anywhere, really. We're going to be securing the endpoint with auth0 later. So I'm quite happy for now to just set up a cause rule that says anybody's allowed to make a request. We could lock that down later if we wanted, but I'm not going to do that today. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to do npm install cause, if I can spell npm. And then while that's installing, which shouldn't take long, we're going to come up in here and we're going to import cause like this, cause. And then we're going to use the app.use, which basically allows us to inject something that our application needs to use, the cause, the result of the call to cause. And this by itself should be enough. We'll restart our service. And now when I make a request over here, we don't get any errors anymore. And in fact, we're getting a 200 response on the post. So our API is running. We're able to make requests from port 8000, but at the moment it's not doing anything. So let's have a look at the next step. What we want to do is create a Fauna database. FaunaDB is a GraphQL cloud database type storage service. So I'm going to create a new database in here. We'll just call it demo. And I could come through in collections and define my own collections, but they also have this useful GraphQL import schema process. So you might have noticed before that I've got this schema. And essentially what I want to do is define a comment, which stores an author, a message, and the slug. Again, the comment needs to be tied to the page itself. And then a couple of queries. We want to be able to find a way of getting all the queries out. And we also want to all the comments out. And we also want to be able to query all the comments for a particular slug. So I'm just going to take the contents of this and import that in here. So if we go to then projects, demos, JAMStack schema. And just like that, we now have our comment collection over here, and we've got the two indexes for getting all the comments out and getting comments for post. I won't go any further into how FaunaDB works today. We'll be using the FaunaDB library for interrogating the data. You can also use GraphQL, use it as a GraphQL endpoint. So whichever way you prefer, neither is better than the other, really. So we've got our database set up now. So let's now import that into, or provide a way of importing that data into the API so that we can post information in and pull information out. So I'm going to stop the API again, and we're going to install, I think it's just called FaunaDB. So we'll install FaunaDB. And then in our index page up here, we're going to define two new variables at the top. FaunaDB is basically going to require the FaunaDB library. And we're also going to create a little helper here because we're going to be doing quite a few queries. Rather than typing this out every time, we're just going to create a helper called Q, which allows us to do those queries. Now, the other thing that we need to do is define the secret for connecting to Fauna. Normally, you'd put that into an environment variable. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put it directly into the index.js. Obviously, before deployment, we would change this. But for the purposes of this demo, we'll just put the secret key in here. And to get that secret key, we just come down to security here. We generate a new key. You can create an admin or a server role. Admin allows you to manage the data. Server actually allows you to manage more than just that. So we just want an admin role. We can give it a name if we wanted to, and save that. And then we need to make sure that we copy this time. We'll never be able to get this out again. So I'm just going to copy that, paste that in here, save that. OK, so now if we came back to our keys here, we could, maybe you can't list them again. It did save it, didn't it? There wasn't a second step that I needed to do. Yeah, well, as with most systems, you can't get the key out again, and it seems like with Fauna you can't even list them. Although I would imagine that that you would need to be able to revoke them somehow. So maybe that's something I need to look into another time. All right, so we've got our client object, or our Fora DB client here instantiated. We passed the key in. So now we can use this client variable, this client object, to perform actions on the Fauna database. So the first thing we want to do is in here, and in fact, one thing we didn't look at before was the body coming through. So body isn't actually coming through. So what I'm going to do before I go further on this is let's just start the service again. We want to make sure that the body that's coming in is actually showing up in our API, otherwise it's not going to work. So let's just jump back into our demo app over here. And if we submit this, the response that we're getting back is nothing. So I think what it probably is that we're not handling the JSON body formatter thing. So I know that Express has one built in. Let's see if I can remember how that one works. So Express JSON body express.json versus body parser. Yeah, so we can use. So often we've installed body parser in the past. For those of you who aren't aware, when Express app runs, there's a number of different ways you can post data to any post endpoint. You've got URL encoded, you've got JSON, you've got files if you wanted to post an actual whole file content. What we want to be able to do is tell Express that it should be able to interpret JSON that comes in and then provide that to us automatically within this request object, rather than us having to do anything else. So if we, in here, I think we can just do app.use express.json, which should give us the ability to interpret JSON that gets posted in. Let's restart the server and make sure that's working. Oh, that's not working. That's because I accidentally deleted this request. All right, let's try it again. Live demos, love them. All right, let's jump back into the browser. We'll come in here, we'll hit submit. And now hopefully we've got a response. We don't have a response. What's going on? Oh no, we've got the response coming through here. For some reason, when I'm returning the response over here, it's not getting sent back as a response for the post. I'm not too concerned about that because we don't need that to come out. But I'm curious why it doesn't. There it is. It's because I was looking at the wrong request. So the message and the author is now going in like we saw before. I'll just see if I can make that bigger. The author is a question mark, and the message is what I actually typed in here. So if I change this to something else, we can then see the most recent response here is the new text. So this is now coming into our API. So let's now do something with that. We are going to, let me just grab this code. Instead of logging the request body here, let's do something with the client. So the client, remember, is the connector to FaunaDB. We're going to make a query. And we're going to generate a query here using this Q shortcut that I created before for the FaunaDB query. What we want to do is we want to create some data in Fauna. And the two parameters it requires is where to put that data. So we're going to use this create a reference to our comment collection. So this is going to be a reference that gets passed in that allows the Fauna API at the back end to know where the data is going in. And then the second part is basically just the data. So it needs to go into a data placeholder, and we're passing in the author, the message, and the post slug. The author and the message here are coming out of request.body, which, as we've seen, are being passed in. And the final part is the post slug, which is actually automatically put into the params area of request by Express, which is pulled out of this part here. So that's going to now, hopefully, if I hit save, pass that information and put it directly into Fauna. So let's just double check that there is no data in Fauna. So if we have a look at indexes, all comments.
And once you finish with that, we have 3 questions in the chat.
Yep. So we've got nothing there. I'll just do the post and we'll make sure it's working, and then we'll have a look at those questions. So test 1 coming in. And if I switch back over here now, this one, we come back into all comments. It hasn't worked because the API is not running. I always forget to restart the API or start it at all. All right, let's run that again. And then back into Fauna. There we go. So we've got our first post comment posted into Fauna, totally unauthenticated though, and we'll come to that. What are the questions?
Okay, so the first one is from Milena. She's asking, you have your markup in JSX with Gatsby and your JavaScript as well. How would we see the difference between JavaScript logic, markup, and API? Could be divided as folders or something like that?
So generally what I do is I have the pages are going to be the main pages that you render. Whenever you go to, if I wanted to create a new page on the local website called About Me, then I would create an about.js. So that's going to go in here. That's your top level page. Anything inside that goes into components, and that generally generates JSX that gets reused across different areas of your application. In terms of the markup, it usually goes into content, and content is where you would store things like the markdown files. And in this case, we're also storing images in with the blog post because this image is specifically related to this blog post. But there's also another assets directory up here, which contains more general asset imagery. The way that this gets accessed is programmatically. So you can actually do within your JavaScript files, you can import these images to use as elements in your application. There's another place where you can put this kind of content though, and that's down under static. And whenever the Gatsby application gets built, all of these files that are existing static are just copied. Nothing happens to them. There's no magic. There's no interpretation or processing. Just takes those files and copies them directly into the public directory. So once you've got the templates rendered, you've got your main pages rendered using information that's in the components that might use data from the content area. And then you also have images that are within the content or assets area or the static. It takes all of those and it builds them into the public directory, which is in here. So you can see here the robots.txt and the fav icon, I think it was, robots.txt and fav icon in static are basically copied directly into public. And in here is where we then create the index page and any of the other static pages. Because the blog posts aren't static in themselves, they're rendered by looking at the markdown. Those files don't exist in here at the moment. I don't know if that answers the question.
I will ask about that to Milena. And the other one is from Christian, that by the way is really involved in this world of Jamstack. He's asking that the FaunaDB query language at first was difficult for me. Do you also feel that way?
Yeah, it took a little bit of getting used to, just because I was so used to SQL. I was able to make my own request. Or in the days before things like GraphQL databases, it was all REST-based endpoints, so there wasn't really a need to structure anything. You just got data in whatever form the API designers gave it to you in. So having a different way of querying, whether it's GraphQL or the FaunaDB query language itself, it's always a bit of a learning curve. I'm still learning things all the time about both GraphQL and the FaunaDB query language. So yeah, stick with it. It's at the end of the day, you're going to have a much more powerful experience as a developer consuming the data using either of these two mechanisms versus standard REST-based endpoints. So I think it's definitely a worthwhile thing to keep at. But yes, it's not. It's a bit of a different mindset to get into for sure.
Okay, we have another one from Juan David. Can we use Nest.js here instead of Express directly?
Yes. So Nest, I think I've done Next, and I think Nest is pretty similar in that it's kind of like a hybrid application, right? So you're running front end and back end in the same code base. So in that case, you have a server which is not an API as such. I guess it kind of operates as an API when the final thing is rendered. But as long as you've got a front-end generatable application that runs in the browser and a way of making requests to functions that run in an environment that you can control. So whether it's an API or Lambda functions or the back end of a Nest or a Next app, that's where you need one of those for storing things like secrets. The FaunaDB secret, for example, we can't put that into the front end. So we need a secure backend where we control access to be able to store those kinds of information. So as long as you meet those two requirements, it doesn't really matter what technology you're using. And again, like I say, that's the nice thing about Jamstack is it doesn't tell you which technologies you need to use. It's more of a philosophy about how you piece those technologies together.
Okay. Since there is a lot of interest about FaunaDB, there is a question that says that are the FaunaDB contests generated at build time or at runtime?
The FaunaDB, what, sorry?
The FaunaDB contents are generated at build time or at runtime.
So the API is just running in the background. It's the Gatsby app that gets built, and Gatsby then within the comments.js here, this is running within the browser. So at runtime within the Gatsby app, we're making a request to our Express API, and the Express API is making requests to Fauna. So Fauna itself will have the data. It essentially treats Fauna as a database. It doesn't have a build time. It's just data that you access through an API. And our Express API is then pulling that information in and making it available to our Gatsby app. So it's not, the FaunaDB information isn't built in to the Gatsby build time. Now, what you could do, though, is if you wanted to store all of your blog posts, not just the comments, in FaunaDB, then down here in Gatsby Node.js, where we're making this request to create all these pages. So I'll just really quickly skip over how this works. I can get into more depth, but it could take a little bit of time. But I'm happy to do that if we want to. So essentially what's happening here is there's this create pages function that gets called during the build process. And inside here, what we're doing is we're getting all the information about the markdown files for the blog posts. And that's coming into this results. And then if there are results, we go through all the edges, which is a GraphQL term for being able to find all of the connections in the data. And for each of the edges, which is now our posts, we go through them and we create a new page. This is a Gatsby function that we're calling. The path to that page is the slug. So that's why we can go to /hello world. And so Gatsby now knows it needs to create a page that will render when hello world is called. This is the component that we're building. So that's a link through to the template and then the context that we're passing in. So what we could do here is instead of using posts is this markdown search, is we could replace this with a FaunaDB query. We could say connect to FaunaDB, pull that down all the blog posts, and for each of the blog posts, build that page instead. So you could use FaunaDB data to statically generate at build time your blog posts rather than statically generating from local markdown files. And when you get to a really sizable blog and you've got lots of posts or you want to have multiple people editing, then of course that's something that might be useful. For a lot of people who run their own blogs, single bloggers, having something where you just edit a markdown file and you push that markdown file to Git, and then something like Netlify or Vercel will automatically pull the changes down and rebuild. That kind of continuous deployment process means that if I wanted to write a new blog post, all I've got to do is create a markdown file, git push, and it's done. So that's quite easy for somebody like me, for somebody like most of the people in our audience. But if you've got people who want to be able to use a CMS or some kind of database back-ended mechanism, then you could certainly do that. I think that more than answered the question. I think I went off at a tangent. So hopefully that answered the original question.
So I guess that you have like a mix between static content and dynamic content, right? For example, you are writing a comment, yep. You are getting the data in a dynamic way. And after that, you can build steady data for that. Okay.
And the main reason we're using a database for comments is because if I have a blog post, a blog website, a blog, and say you want to write a comment, if it was done at build time, you would have to fork my code, download it, add a markdown comment, push that up, submit a pull request, which I would then have to accept, and then it gets. So that's not a great that's not a great user experience for people to put comments onto a blog post. So that's why that's a lot more dynamic. That's why there's a database backend and an API and soon authentication to allow anybody to write a blog, to add a comment to a blog post. All right, unless there's any more questions, I'll keep going. So we've got the data coming into FaunaDB now. The next thing we want to do is pull these comments back out and show them in our application. So what we'll do is jump back into, we are in the Gatsby app here. So let's just close some of these. Here's the comments, here's the blog post. So down at the bottom here, where we're showing our comments at the moment, what we now want to do is also list our comments. So in fact, we'll put that into the comments component because it's all part of the same thing. So at the moment, we've just got our form here. Let's just do a pull for now to see what's in the database. So we want to store more information. At the moment, we're storing the message here, which is the message that gets sent. We also want to store a list of our comments. So let's create this empty array of comments, and we've got our set comments handler here. Now what we want to do is populate this with some comments to display. So in React, when you're using functional components, there's this useEffect hook. And essentially what that's doing is the first item that gets sent through is a function, and the second one is an array of dependencies that are required within the function. So anytime post slug changes, this function is going to get called. And it's going to get called just once now, right at the beginning, because when the comments component is loaded, it gets sent to the post slug, which we can then pass into this function here at first component load time. It means that we can run, because single page apps don't really have a loading, like every page doesn't load from the beginning. There's no load process. We need a way to be able to run code the first time a component is shown. And that's essentially what this is doing. So we're going to make a request to another endpoint. In fact, it's the same. I'm going to, because we had that bug before, I'm just going to change this to this. So that we're calling exactly the same endpoint. But this time, instead of passing through method post, we're not passing a method, so the default is now get. So we're making a get request to this endpoint now, and any response that we get out, we're going to interpret as JSON. We're going to take that JSON, we're going to pass it into the set comments. So that JSON we get back is going to go into this comments. So down here, for now, we're just going to copy this bit of code. Let's put it above the form. We're just going to print out what's in our comments, just for now, so we can see what's going on. So if we hit save on that, we've got a failure because I haven't pulled in useEffect. So right up here, we've got useState. We need useEffect as well. Hit save on that, and we're good. So we could have a look at the website now. It's not going to work because we've got our blank array because that's the default that we set in the React app, but we've got this 404 now on this endpoint here. There's no get handler in our API. So let's add the get handler, which is in here. So let's just make this a little bigger. So we've got this one, that's the post. Let's just copy that, put that in here, and we'll make that a get. So there's our get handler. What should we do in here? For now, let's just return, just to make sure it's working, an array that contains hello. So we should be able to now see, if I save that and I restart the API and we jump back over here, probably even without loading, we do need to reload, we should get hello. So we've got one object being returned here, one array element being returned here. But of course, we want this to be our comment, not the word hello. That's a bit useless to us at the moment. So now what we need to do is create another query. This one's a little longer, but we'll step through it again. Just copy that. So in our get over here, we're going to run this query against the client. And if I put some formatting in, sometimes the formatting from code isn't the best for being able to read things. So let me, I think that's the end of that one, end of that one. All right, so essentially what we're doing is, remember before when we called the create, we had to pass in two parameters, a reference to what we want to create something in and the actual data. When we're reading, we don't need to provide any secondary data. So all we really need, actually no, we do, and I'll explain why in a second. What we need is that request, that reference to the index that we're searching and the value that we're searching on. If we just jump quickly back over into the FaunaDB application over here, we had the all comments, which is what I was using to see everything. But in order to pull out just comments for a certain post, we also created in that schema file that we looked at before, a second way of requesting information out, which requires a post slug. So in here, if we added hello world as a request, we would get out only the comments made for hello world. So So that's provided out of the box already by FaunaDB, and that's what we're going to do here. We're going to use the find comments for post, pass in the post slug, and then what we're going to do is pass that into match. So essentially what we're saying is we want you to get all of these where we want to get all of the comments where there's a match for the post slug. Then we pass that into paginate, which is basically Fauna's way of saying I want a collection. Otherwise, we might only get one element. So we want to paginate it. We're not providing any other functionality though, so there's only going to be one page of all the data, and we pass that into query. So this is now going to return us a list of reference objects. This is where it gets a little bit confusing with FaunaDB. And again, I won't go into this hugely, but essentially what it's doing is it's returning a reference to a document, not the data itself. So what we're going to do at this point here is we're going to iterate through all of these objects. We're going to get just the reference back for that object and create an array of references of just the reference numbers. And then we're going to make another query here just for the references. So it's like a query in a query. The first thing we're doing is saying, get all reference objects that match this request that we've got here, this match, and then get all the reference IDs out and then make a request for all the actual data for those IDs. And that's what comes back as the comments. So we're going to, again, interpret that response as JSON, and then probably need to output that somewhere. Do we do that somewhere already? Oh yeah, res.json. So that's the response. I was thinking that was the way you interpret the JSON, but we're actually calling the response object here and calling the JSON function or method on the response object and passing all the comments back out. Bit of error handling down here, and in case anything goes wrong, we don't need that one anymore. Let's save that, restart, make sure there's no errors. That's all working fine. So now if we come back to our application, we should see, and we hit refresh, we should see our first comment come through. So let's just make this a bit bigger. I'll make that text a bit bigger. So like I mentioned before, when you're talking to FaunaDB, you're getting lots of references. So we've got a whole reference bit of information here that we don't really care about. We've got the timestamp, and then we've got our actual data. And then we've got the data that we want to show. So if we want, for each element here, so here's the array of comments. For each comment, we want to come down and get the data element. And in data, we want to get out the author and the message. So we jump back into our code here, and I'll just paste this in so we can see what's going on. Let's do this instead. So for each comment that comes back, we're going to print out comment data message, and then the name of the author. Let's do that instead. So now jumping back over to here, I didn't even need to hit reload because Gatsby's magic. We've now got the first comment over here. If I do a test2 and submit that, now because we've submitted it, it's made a post to FaunaDB. We don't know that the change has been made. So currently we're not programmatically reloading this. If I just hit reload in the web page though, come down here, we've now got our second comment. So already now we've added probably what we were at before 30, we've added 10 lines of code to our comment.js, and we've added 30 to 40, 13 lines of code, plus a couple of includes at the top here to our API. And we're now getting comments back into our system. So the final part of the puzzle is to make it so that anybody can read the comments, but only logged in people can post comments. I realized we're at 10:30 now, so I think the questions have been pushing this out a little bit. I don't have anything coming up next, so I'm happy to keep going. If you want me to speed things up, Ruben, just let me know, and I can start copying and pasting faster and putting in less explanation, but I'm happy to spend the time on this. You just let me know what's good for you and the audience.
Well, it's up to you, but I'm going to ask in the chat too, okay? 1 second.
Yeah, you do that. If we keep going, I'm good with that. I don't have anything for the next few hours. It's still only 10:30 in the morning for me, so I've got a whole day.
Really? How much time are you thinking? Like 30 minutes or how much?
I reckon at the speed we're currently going, maybe 30 minutes. I think I'll probably have it done in maybe 15, but there might be more questions that come along. I enjoy spending the time to answer questions thoroughly, so I'm happy to do that.
Okay, so let's go for 30 minutes, okay?
Cool. All right, so about, I think, Ruben, you might know better than me. I think it was about 2 months ago, Auth0 released the React SDK, which is awesome. it used to be that implementing Auth0 in React would take about 5 to 10 minutes. Now I think one of my colleagues managed to do it in 45 seconds. It'll take me longer because I'm going to step through it, but it's so easy. So what we're going to do is we're going to install this Auth0 React SDK. There's also the Auth0 SPA SDK, which is for generic single-page applications. But because we're using React, there's one that provides a lot more out-of-the-box functionality. Means we don't have to write as much code. So I'm going to install this. Now, if you're using Gatsby and you go to the Auth0 website and you create a new, and we'll look at this in a second, you create a new application in Auth0 and you go to the quick start guide, there is no Gatsby option at the moment. There is React and there is the React SDK. But there are a couple of differences between React and Gatsby that you need to bear in mind, which we'll look at now. So you can't just follow the quick start guide exactly. There are a couple of little differences. We'll have a look at that, how that works. So the first thing we want to do is, it's still running at the bottom. First thing we want to do is configure our Gatsby application to be able to provide the Auth0 functionality to any of the components within our application that need to use them. So let's close the API, come back down to the blog here, and we're going to have a look at the Gatsby browser.js. So this is often blank when you start a blank Gatsby application. Because we've started with the blog starter, it's automatically pulled in some typefaces and stuff to make it look pretty. But this is basically because Gatsby is running on a server during build time, there is no browser. It's like React is always running in a browser. So this script basically allows us to do a whole lot of things to tell Gatsby how to do things if it was like for when it's running in a browser. And the parallel to this, if you haven't used Gatsby and you have used React, is the script in React, which I think might actually just be the index page, I'm not sure, where you define the app element that contains where you start your application to start with. I'm not being very clear about that. Let me just start writing some code and we'll see what's happening in here. So we need to pull in React, which happens with all React components. So we'll leave that up there. And because we just installed the Auth0 React SDK, we've now got access to this Auth0 provider. So what we want to do is use this provider to provide Auth0 capabilities to all of our components. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to wrap the root element of our application with the Auth0 provider. So what we'll get into that is the actual element. So when Gatsby starts building the application, your application is all of your components and your pages and everything that goes inside of it. That's the element that composes your React app at the end of the day, essentially, that Gatsby is building. And that element we want to wrap. So let's just close that off. And what we want to do is we want to return. So what we would normally do is we would just return the element, and that's your application. That would now work. But we want to wrap this element in the Auth0 provider. So let's do that. So we'll just put some brackets around here because it's going to be slightly more complicated stuff. So the Auth0 provider now wraps your element, but we need to provide some, oops, let's just undo that. We need to provide some configuration to the Auth0 provider. And the main things that need to get passed in are the domain. We need to pass in the client ID, which is probably not auto-completing very well at the moment because I'm not finishing things. So let's say domain client ID, there we go. We need to pass in a redirect URI, which is going to be where the user's redirected to after they log in. We also need an on-redirect callback. So this is where one of the differences happens between Gatsby and React. The way that Gatsby does the callback is it needs to handle the history change. So basically when you log in, the Auth0 will redirect your user back to the application and include a code in the query string, which allows Auth0 to then turn that into a token. I won't go into the technical details of that, but we need to handle that callback slightly differently. And finally, this is something you don't necessarily need to have unless you're using an API that you're also doing, that you're writing. Because we're writing an API that's going to consume our token, we need to add that API in as an audience so that when we tell Auth0 to log one of our users in, we can say to Auth0, we need a token so that we know who the user is, but we need that token to also work for our API. So we're going to add the audience in here, which is going to be our API. So let's quickly jump over to Auth0. I'm going to create a new tenant. So for those of you who haven't used Auth0 before, you'll see what it looks like from the start. So let's just call this demo 2020, what's the date today? 0807, which is the 6th for you. But I am in the future. And I tell you what, it's good weather tomorrow. So I hope you look forward to that. So that's creating. So when you create your Auth0 account from scratch, this is what you'll see. We will need to create two things here. We need to create an application, that's our Gatsby app. We'll need to create an API, which allows our API to then consume the tokens that are generated when the user's logged in. So we've got a generic one here. I'm going to create a new one because we want a single page application here. Just keep calling it my app. And like I mentioned before, there's a whole lot of quick start guides, and React is one of them. But there are a couple of changes in there. The main things that I want for today, though, are from settings, and that's the domain. So we'll copy that and put that in here. We want the client ID, so I'll copy that and we'll put that in here. The redirect URI, we're not actually going to specify a string for that one. We're going to pass through window, I can't type, window.location.origin. So basically, whichever web page we're currently looking at will be redirected back to that web page. And then the on-redirect callback, I'm just going to copy this in here. We need to define a little helper function up at the top here. So we're going to pull out the navigate method from Gatsby. And on redirect callback, we're going to take the return to, which is stored in the app state, which is something that happens inside the Auth0. No, it's not something that happens inside the Auth0 provider. When we do things like a logout, we can provide return to as a parameter to say we want the user to go back to this URL. Otherwise, it's just going to take them to the home page. So if we defined a return to, it would take us back there. And what we want to do is we want to replace the URL in the browser with this new URL so that if somebody bookmarks the page, for example, they don't bookmark that code that comes back. So we've got this new redirect callback handler here. So now down here, we'll just do the on redirect callback. So that there is basically a reference to this function here. And finally, the audience is going to be our API. So we'll save that. And that's pretty much it. So the thing is, at the moment, we're not requiring anybody to log in. So let's jump into our layout. Layout is the wrapper. So if you look at the blog post here again, you can see that when we render the blog post to start with, the first thing we do is wrap everything in layout. This is very common in a Gatsby or a React app, and that's defined up here. So within layout, we're getting the children, which is what we need to render, and we're rendering them down here. So let's add a couple of things to this. We want to include a user navigation, which we're going to put after the header and before the user. And because this user navigation, I could create a component over here and break it out, but because it's only used in the layout, I'm just going to be a little bit lazy. I'm going to include the configuration of this component just inside this application itself. So if we jump up to the top, or this file itself. So we jump up at the top before we define the layout, we're now going to define the user navigation. And something that we're going to need to use here is this use Auth0 hook. So I'm just going to pull that in. Let's have a quick look at what's going through here. So use Auth0 is a hook that's provided by the SDK that we just installed. And from that, we can get a number of things. We can get variables that tell us whether or not the process of authentication is still loading, whether or not we have a, well, not whether or not we have a user, but if there's a user, the actual user object. And then we've got functions to call if we want to log the user in or if we want to log the user out. So essentially, is loading is going to be true until we know the state of the user. Right at the very beginning, we don't know if they're logged in or logged out because we have to ask Auth0 whether or not they're logged in or logged out. Because remember, if you refresh a single page application, you lose all the state. We don't, unless you're storing things in local storage, which is not recommended when it comes to authentication, we need to know whether or not the user is loading. So if we don't know, we just return nothing. There's no menu at all shown. Otherwise, we carry on. If we have a user account, then obviously they're logged in. So we provide them with a logout button. Otherwise, we provide them with a login button. So if we save that, that should be enough for us to get let's refresh. Site can't be reached. So it's always important to run Gatsby again after you install new. Am I still sharing the screen? My screen share just popped up. Just let me know you can still see what I'm doing.
Yeah, we are still seeing your screen.
Okay, good. So we've restarted Gatsby there. It's just building our blog pages from the Markdown files. If I hit refresh, it should come up any second. Building. There we go. Running now. So now we've got our login button. The login button came up very quickly because one of the other things that the SDK will do is it'll store a local variable in a cookie that just says whether or not the user's logged in. We don't have that cookie, therefore we know they're not logged in. So if I hit the login button now, we should be redirected to our demo URL over here, but there's something that's gone wrong. We haven't defined or we haven't configured auth0. This is actually a fairly easy step. We'll jump back in over here. For security reasons, auth0 will only allow an application to use its mechanisms for login if there's a defined callback URL, logout URL, and web origin. This makes sure that auth0 will only redirect your users back to URLs that you intend them to be using. It stops things like attacks where somebody might accidentally or intentionally get your users to click on something that logs them out of your website and then redirects to another website or various things like that. So it's just an extra security mechanism on top. So what we need to do is, let's come back to here. So this is where we want people to be able to log in and out of without the hello world part. So I'm just going to come in here and say the allowed callback URL is this one here. And when we log out, we can go back to port 8000, and any requests from localhost on port 8000 can be accepted for the login process. People are allowed to come from here. Always go down to the bottom and save changes. Catches me out quite a few times. So let's go back over here. Shouldn't need to reload. We just click on the login button and we're logged in. This is because at some point in the past, I was already logged into this, this tenant. Oh no, it's giving me a different error. What's going on over here? I'm just going to come in, and sometimes this is required in when you're testing, is sometimes local storage of things in cookies and whatever else can be can get some information inside of that makes the login process break. It won't happen when you get into production because you're not tinkering with it to the level we are here at the moment. So in session storage here, there might be some cookies already. There's this auth0 spa cookie here, so we're going to delete that one. I'll just delete this one as well. Hopefully that'll fix it. It's not working. What's going on? Check my notes, make sure I've done everything I'm supposed to have done. It looks like it. So let's come down and have a look at the logs and see whether or not it's even hitting our endpoint. So we're getting a failed login, service not found, localhost port 3000. This is why. So when we defined, and there's two ways we can solve this for getting it working now. When we define down here the audience, we're saying to auth0, we want this token to work on for this audience, but auth0 doesn't know what this is. So for now, I'm just going to comment this out so that we can get the login working. And we'll look at how we define that in a second. So let's come back in here, click login, and now we can sign in. So auth0 now knows that it's creating just an ID token, an access token, probably actually just the ID token, but there'll be an access token as well for the front-end application. Because this is a new tenant, I'm going to have to do a sign up. So we'll just create a brand new account. This kind of authorization thing is currently only happening because I'm doing testing in localhost. Sometimes it happens in production as well, especially when you're going between potentially untrusted systems where you want to get a user to specifically say, yes, I allow this to happen, but you can disable that as well. So it's whether or not it's a first party or third party connection. But because we're running in localhost, it'll always show, but you can configure that. So now we've got a log out button because we know that we're logged in. So what we can do if we come back into the hello world over here is we could now show or hide this depending on whether or not the user is logged in. But let's continue with the process of getting the authentication to work for the post first, and then we'll look at cleaning up the UI. So at the moment, whenever we make a post request, it gets sent to the API. We need to define the API now. So let's come in over here before I created an application, and that's our single page app here. Let's come in now and create an API. And the name here, I'm just going to call it API. The identifier, this is an interesting one. So the identifier is essentially, it can be any string. It's generally a URL. It doesn't have to be the URL that you're running it on. It just has to be an identifier that's used for linking it. We generally use the URL though, so that when we're looking at this, we have an understanding of what the actual endpoint is that we want to connect people to. So I'm going to put in localhost 3000 here. But just bear in mind in the future, and this has to be unique as well. So bear that in mind in the future, especially in testing environments and testing tenants. I've often given them slightly different names, even though it might still be running on port 3000 for testing purposes. But if you're getting, most of the time you won't hit that issue. If you get any issues with this at any point in the future, feel free to hit me up for any help that you might need. So we've got our API now. We want to implement the Node.js version of this. So I'll grab these two here. So we're going to need to pull these in. Let's come back into our index for our API. And we'll just put that up at the top here. So we need to install these first. So let's copy that one and this one. And essentially what this is doing is it's giving us the ability to create an object that checks the JSON Web Token that comes in as part of the authentication. And we'll add that to Gatsby in a second by calling this Express JWT. And it allows Express to essentially have a built-in way of processing JSON Web Tokens that come into the header. Now, we want to make sure that the JSON Web Token hasn't been modified, though. And a JSON Web Token has a header, a payload, and a signature. The payload is the bit that we're interested in. That contains the information about the user, or it might be the access token. But the signature is what allows us to verify that the payload hasn't been changed. And that signature, because we're using a public-private key hashing algorithm, RSA 256, that signature is defined in this JSON file here. So we're going to grab the keys, the public keys out of this URL. We're going to pass those in as the secret to our JSON Web Token function here, which is going to give us this check capability that we can add into the whole application. So we can say secure the whole application. Every request has to have a valid JSON Web Token just by adding this line in here. So let's just copy this and we'll put that in. Let's put that in just after we create the 400DB client. So we've now got access to JWT check. So we can put this in here, but for our purposes, we want our get endpoint to still be public. We don't need a JSON Web Token or to be logged in to read comments. So rather than passing it into the whole application, you can pass it in as the second parameter of any of the endpoint functions. In this case, on the post here, we want to secure just the post. So we'll put JWT check in here. And simply by doing that, our endpoint should now be secured. So if I just save and I restart our API, we haven't changed anything in our Gatsby app at the moment. So technically, regardless of whether or not we're logged in, we shouldn't be able to make a new submission over here. And if there's the clear one. In Firefox, it's a bin. That looks like a no entry sign to me. Anyway, so if we submit something now, we get a 401 unauthorized. So let's fix that. That's a really easy one to do. I love it's made easy because of the fact that we've got so many helper functions in JavaScript. So up here, when we're fetching, all we need to do is pass in a second parameter, which is an object that contains various configuration directives. So what we want to do here, and we've seen this already over here where we had the methods. And in fact, it's this one we want to edit and we'll guest. So let's just undo that. So in here, we've got the headers, we've got the content type. We want to add a second header, which is going to be authorization. And the way the JSON Web Tokens work is they get passed through as a pure string prefixed with the word bearer, because they're what is defined as a bearer token, which means if a bearer is somebody who holds something, if you have this token, you have access. So the bearer identifies themselves as this variable token. So we just pass that through, but we need to get that token from somewhere. So this is the fun bit with when we don't have it here yet. So let's in here also, or rather in this one here. Can I do it in there? Maybe it needs to be out of this one. We'll do it in this one anyway. So we want to pull in from the useAuth0 hook, get token silently. Get token silently. What this does is it provides us an endpoint that we can call that will get the access token for us if the user's logged in. If they're not logged in, it'll fail silently. Because if the person's not logged in, we don't want an error to come up or to be forced to log in. We only want to use this token in the case the person is logged in so that we can give them the ability to submit a new comment. So in here now, after we prevent a default, before we make this fetch call, we're going to get token silently. And that's a promise that returns to us a token. So we can simply wrap the whole of this, there's that end there, in here. So now this value token here is defined when the get token silently succeeds. So this by itself, I'm getting some errors here. Unexpected template string expression, comment 17. Need backticks there. There you go. So we've now got a successful write here. If I come over here, and now I didn't actually need to refresh that, but let's do that anyway. And now I post another comment. We get token silently is not a function because I wonder if it's because, and one thing I haven't changed yet again is I need to add this audience back in. So let's add the audience back in. We've defined that API in the Auth0 area now. So let's log out and log back in again. It doesn't want to allow me to log out. Check render method of comments. I've made an error somewhere. What am I doing wrong? I'm just going to comment this lot out. Do a hard refresh. We're not getting each child in a list should have a unique key property, but that's only a warning. That shouldn't stop anything. Fill to load this endpoint here. I think it's because I've added, let me just comment this one out again. Let's get us back to a state where it's working, because I think what's happening is we're getting a conflict now between requiring a token for a certain end API. So let's have a look at the applications again. We'll come in here and we'll delete our cookies. So that we can do this from scratch. Okay, we're not logged in. That's good. Let's now put the audience back in, which should reload this page. We're still not logged in. Now if we log in and we provide the credentials, we're going to get a request now to authorize access for the API. So now it's saying that my app, which is the name of the API, is requesting access. And if we look at, I don't know whether it'll still be in there, but if we look at the network tab now, we should have, let's do a hard refresh, we should have a request down here somewhere for Auth0's authorize endpoint. We're getting an error here. Why is this happening? Something's wrong. There's a misconfiguration. The specific URL port 8000 does not have a registered origin. Something I always get wrong, well, not always, but often, is the trailing slash. So we actually need to remove these here. because when you go to the root, if you make a request just from that URL and there's a slash at the end in Auth0, Auth0 is going to say, I require more of a URL to consider your request valid. So let's just save those changes. And we'll refresh this. All right, so we'll get our login button now. Let's log in again. Now, this hasn't asked me to log in because I was already logged in. It's just that the Gatsby app had lost the session to remember that I was logged in. Auth0 remembered that I was logged in, so I'm logged in automatically. And now we can see down here the response that comes back from token. We're getting an access token, which is this JSON Web Token. So let's have a quick look at what this JSON Web Token looks like. Meanwhile, we should be able to come down to the bottom here of Hello World. We should now be able to make a request, a post of test3, which if we look at the console log, shouldn't have any errors. If we refresh the page, have I restarted everything? This is running. Okay, so we're getting an error over here now. No authorization token was found. Let's just restart this one. You know why? Because I commented this lot out. So we've got our token coming through now. Let's uncomment this. So now we're going to get the token out and we're going to make a post to the API. That's usually helpful. So let's get this one again and we'll hit submit. Get token silently is failing again. This is a good experience, isn't it? One thing, so I often do live demos. Get token silently is not a function. I often do live demos and they can often fail. But one of the things that I like about that is that hopefully it's giving you permission to go out and try, because failure is how we learn. And I'm continuously learning. So get token silently is a function here that should be accessible from there. I don't think it's meant to go in here, but we can give that a try. Yeah, it does need to be outside of the hook. So we've got get token silently. Let's do a refresh. It's really not liking it. Ruben, if you have any thoughts, I'm happy for any input because this is confusing me at the moment.
Yeah, let me check.
So pressing...
Meanwhile, Ben, we have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
I'm seeing that there is a lot of interest about like the folder structure and how you are separating the API with the front end. And there are some questions, for example, if you recommend implementing monorepos when you are working with Jamstack, or what is the best practice for organizing folders and files?
Sure. So the answer to that isn't quite as, there's no easy answer. If you're using something like Vercel, for example, they have their own Lambda function capability. So anything you put inside the API directory within your application becomes a Lambda function that you can call from within your single page app. So in that kind of situation, it makes sense to have a monorepo, to have the API and the front end code in one place. I personally prefer to keep them separate because that way, and also I'm still not quite sure whether or not I'm right, but my current opinion is that while Vercel and Netlify and all of these cloud-based hosting platform providers have their own Lambda functionality, if I write it specifically for that platform, it makes it harder to move to another platform. Now, I don't know at this point whether I'm over-engineering for something that might never happen, but if I define all of my APIs as Express APIs, I can host those anywhere. If I define all of my front-end applications, my Gatsby or my React apps as standalone, I can host those anywhere. So one of the projects I'm working on, and Ruben helped me with a few weeks ago, which I think you mentioned earlier, Hoist, is a platform that allows people to fund programs for climate change. And I've written those as two separate applications, and I've actually got the API running on Vercel and the front end running on Netlify. Now I could move those two anywhere, and having them separate allows me to do that. It also allows me to scale up resources for the API if that starts getting hit heavily, without having to scale up resources for a front end application, which is static and probably not going to require more resources. So it gives me more flexibility. So there's no real right or wrong, but have a think about how you want to deploy your application in the future, and use that to inform whether or not you do a monorepo now. If you're still not sure, I would probably go with having two repos or multiple repos for each component, so that you can still run them as one if you want, but it's already separate if that's what you decide later. So it doesn't really answer your question, but that's just my thoughts on how I do things.
Okay, and the issue you're having here, you are missing the access. The name of the function is get access token silently.
Thank you.
Yep.
It's probably an auto. There you go. I should have just written get access token silently. Yes, because of course there are multiple kinds of tokens. There are access tokens, there are ID tokens, and there are refresh tokens. We want the access token. Thanks, Ruben.
You're welcome.
All right, so let's jump back over here. We should now be at a point where this is working. So we've got test 1, test 2, test 3. Let's just clear this, and we'll also clear this so we can see what's going on under the hood. So we're making a request here to, it's on all, login required. All right, let's log in. So that's a good starting point. I need to log in to be able to use this. Now we have an access token. Let's go back into Hello World. Let's come down here. Test 3. Okay, we'll clear this and we'll clear network tab and hit submit. So now we're making a request here to comment/hello world on port 3000. That's the options request. Here's the post request. Here's the data that we're sending in, and the response is that it worked fine. We can see in console that there's no errors. So before, when I hit submit, it said 401 authorization required. Now that we're logged in, the token gets pulled out and gets passed in. And in fact, we can see that in this post request here, under the headers, authorization bearer, and there's the token that we got from auth0. So now if we refresh this page, we should be able to see that the user's logged in. One final thing I'm going to do, just as a bit of a fun thing, is currently we've just got this author over here. So I'm going to change this to be the user.nickname. And to get the user out, we simply come up here to use auth0, and so we want user as well. And if I just hit save, hopefully this does it. And I come back down here and we put in test 4, and then we refresh. Did I refresh too quickly? Post. Did that submit? I'm getting an error. Login required. There's something strange going on with cookies in this browser at the moment.
Maybe because you're using Chromium. I'm not sure.
Maybe. It could be one of my many privacy plugins as well. So let's just double check our network tab here. I think I've just did test 4. Let's also do test 5. We've got our request here. It looks like it's gone through, and you can see here that author Ben has been passed in. That's because my user information from auth0 shows that my nickname is Ben, and now we're getting the actual author's name. So in about an hour and a half, including lots of question times and a little bit of a mistake on my part, not knowing my function names, we've managed to take a blank Gatsby application that's got a blog built in and add authenticator commenting systems with the ability to still, if we log out, we are logged in. We then specifically log out and then go back down here and have a look. Then we've got all the comments still coming out. But if I put in test 6, this should fail because I'm not logged in. There we go, got login required. And if I refresh the page, then we can see that we still only have the 5 comments. So there it is. I mean, it's not been a clean process. I like to do, and I was telling Ruben and the organizers before we went live that I like to do these step by step, how I think about things. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about my process of how I build an application from scratch, start a new MVP level application and API. I'm glad that you asked me questions throughout. It's been fun. if you do have any more questions, I'm more than happy to take them. But I shall finish with this slide here to thank you for your time. And yeah, there's some links down at the bottom there if you want to get more information about this talk. Thank you.
Awesome, Ben. Thank you so much for your time. I think that in the future, we should organize another meetup with you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah,
I'm sorry I went over time as well. It was quite a long session. I hope everybody in Colombia isn't falling asleep.
Yeah, but thank you so much, Ben, for your time. We really enjoyed the session, many questions. And I will let you know any feedback we received, but yeah, it was a really great session. Thank you so much for your time. We are really happy to have you.
And just to add as well, my name, Ben Dechrai, it's my handle on most social media accounts. My Twitter messages are open, so I don't need to be following you for you to DM me. Get in touch with me via any means if you have questions or want to chat more about not just Auth0, but anything to do with what I've spoken about today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ben.
Welcome.
Ok, bueno, muchas gracias a todos por participar, por hacer preguntas. Fue una sesión excelente. Si tienen más preguntas para Ben, se la pueden hacer llegar a través de nosotros o también lo pueden seguir en Twitter y en sus redes sociales. Siéntanse libres de preguntarle. Es un amigo más. De hecho, él ya ha estado en Colombia. Ahorita en febrero estuvo en la PyConf. Entonces, ella conoce Medellín. Entonces, siéntanse como en la confianza de escribirle y preguntarle cualquier cosa que necesiten. Él está para ayudarles. Y nos vemos en el próximo Meetup. Muchas gracias a todos. Jonathan, sí.
¿Qué pasó con el tema entonces qué te dijo Miguel de las suscripciones?
Bueno, vamos a seleccionar 10 de las personas que se registraron. Vamos a seleccionar 10 personas aleatoriamente para asignarles el código. Y las personas que ganaron, les vamos a enviar el código al correo. Yo le voy a pedir a Ben de que diga 10 números aleatorios, aunque ya no está aquí, se acaba de desconectar, pero le iba a preguntar que dijera los 10 números aleatorios. Dame un segundo.
Hola.
Hola, Cami.
Todavía está ahí, Ben.
No, ya se fue. Sí está acá. Sorry. Ben, can you give us like 5 minutes for saying the random numbers?
Yes.
One second.
¿Viste cuántas personas se suscribieron? ¿Se inscribieron al formulario o no?
No, estoy revisando en este instante.
Dale.
Dame un segundito. Jonathan, ¿tienes el link del formulario?
No, Miguel no me lo pasó.
No lo tengo acá.
No. Espérate, le pregunto un momento. Un momento que le estoy preguntando.
While you're working that out, I've just been looking at the comments and I see that Juan asked about whether monorepos could still be useful for something like shared logic. That's certainly something you could think about. If there's significant logic that you want to share, you could even put them into modules though, and then use those across multiple different deployments.
There was another question, Ben, the API that you created with Express, it was a separate project, or is part of this same front-end project? It's just in another folder.
Two separate folders, 2 separate projects. What I did was I opened Visual Code at the top level. So if we go back into here. So I opened code at this level here with JAMStack, and in there we've got the API and blog. But what I would do is I would define that as one repo and that as another repo. The main reason why I opened code at this level here is so I could just have one window open for demo purposes. But when I'm working on code instance for the Gatsby application and another code instance for the Express app, so I do those separately. It's just for demos. It's easier to have it in one version of code.
Yo ya le estoy preguntando a Miguel lo del archivo.
Él ya me dio como la URL, pero todavía no me da, pues no puedo acceder. O sea, si algo, esta es la tiro acá. Porque yo aquí en este momento no sé por qué no la puedo abrir.
No nos dio permisos.
No sé si no puedo entrar todavía. Todavía está el stream en vivo, ok.
Claro, porque vamos a entregar los códigos en vivo, pues, para
Okay.
asegurar de que lo estamos haciendo transparente.
Esperemos un segundito que Miguel nos está dando acceso al archivo.
Ya tengo acceso al archivo.
Ah, listo.
Tenemos 19, vamos a rifar 10, ¿cierto?
Sí, son 10.
Bueno, le voy a pedir los 10 a Ben, que me los diga, ¿listo? Okay, Ben, we have 19 candidates.
Yep.
Can you tell us like 10 different numbers?
From 2 to 19.
Or from 2 to 19.
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah.
So I'll do it. Right. So I don't know if you can see what I'm sharing on the screen, but I thought I'd do this with code. So random mod 18 plus 2 should give us a number between 2 and 19. So number 4.
Okay, 1 second. Juan Fernando.
Let me know when you're ready for the next one.
Yeah, 4. Yeah, the next one, 6, right?
Number 6.
6. Freddy Sarmiento. 14. Sergio.
19.
19. Tenemos a Wilson Castro.
7.
7. Tenemos a Alejandro Restrepo.
13.
15.
13.
Jairo Cuartas.
No, era 13, era 13.
Ah, ok,
13.
perdón. 13. Sergio Valencia.
Jairo Cuartas, no. Qué pena.
Sí, qué pena. Ojalá te lo ganes en el próximo. Dale. Next,
12.
12. Guillermo Betancourt.
1. Why is there a 1? Oh, I've got the wrong code again. Let's do that one
Yeah.
there. 14 we've got already. 13 we've got already. 16.
16. Daniel Calle.
How many more do we need?
We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 3 more.
3.
3. Jenny Ruiz.
9.
9. Juan David Nichols.
I love how a random number generator gave me 3 3s in a row.
Yeah.
I mean, technically still random, but it doesn't feel
Not
like
random at all.
it. That's right. I think we've done 7 already, haven't we?
Yes, we have already 7.
Number 2.
Yeah, 2. Luis Felipe Machado.
And the last one is...
One second. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We already have 10, Ben.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay,
Was it-
awesome. Thank you so much.
That's all right.
Bueno, entonces les vamos a enviar el correo electrónico a los ganadores, los códigos de acceso al curso de Udemy. Muchas gracias a todos. See you later, Ben. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Time.
Congratulations to all the winners. Thanks everyone for the questions.
Thank you. See you later.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Ok.